The acrid bite of coal smoke clawed at Alice's throat as consciousness dragged her back from the black void like iron hooks in her soul. Her eyelids fluttered open to a world painted in hellish amber, where flames danced against what remained of her sawed house walls like demons celebrating their victory over mortal hope. The crushing weight pressing down on her chest made each breath a desperate battle against suffocation. And for one terrifying heartbeat, panic seized her heart like a vice crushing her very spirit. Then she saw him. A man loomed above her in the flickering darkness, his long black hair falling loose around shoulders, broad enough to eclipse the burning rafters overhead. Sweat beaded on his bronze skin, mixing with streaks of ash that painted warlike lines across his angular face. His powerful arms trembled with tremendous exertion, muscles corded tight as ship's rope as he braced himself against the massive wooden beam that would have crushed her ribcage to powder. "Don't move," he commanded through gritted teeth, each word forced out between labored breaths that spoke of agony beyond description. "Breathe with me." Alice's mind reeled in terror and confusion. This was no fever dream conjured by smoke inhalation. This was a Lakota warrior pressed intimately against her in the most compromising position imaginable, his chest rising and falling mere inches from her face. Every frontier warning she'd ever heard screamed at her to flee, to fight, to do anything but lie still beneath this stranger who could snap her neck with a simple twist of those powerful hands. But something in his obsidian eyes held her captive. Not the savage hunger she'd been taught to fear since childhood, but fierce determination etched in every weathered line of his face. Concentration furrowed his brow as he bore the full crushing weight of timber that would have turned her bones to splinters and her life to memory. "Stay with me." He breathed, and she realized with startling clarity that he wasn't her captor. He was her salvation made flesh. The sharp crack of rifle fire split the night air outside, like winter ice breaking under spring pressure, followed by the thunder of hoofbeats circling her property in predatory loops. Whoever had set this inferno meant to finish what they'd started, and they prowled the darkness beyond her ruined walls like wolves scenting wounded prey. The warrior, she could think of him no other way, shifted his position with careful precision, never allowing the beam to settle its crushing weight upon her fragile form. With fluid grace born of long practice, he drew a bone-handled knife from his belt, its blade catching the firelight like captured lightning as he wedged it beneath the timber. The muscles in his forearms bulged with tremendous effort, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body like a forge as he worked to create enough leverage for her escape. "When I say move, roll hard to your left." He instructed, his breath warm against her ear, despite the inferno surrounding them like the very gates of perdition. "Fast as you can manage." Alice nodded mutely, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Her cotton chemise had torn during the collapse, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable in ways that transcended mere modesty. But there was no time for embarrassment when death stalked just beyond her threshold, like a patient hunter. Now she rolled with desperate strength as he lifted the beam, groaning in protest like a living thing in agony as it shifted against his knife blade. Sweet air rushed into her starved lungs despite the acrid smoke that still choked the ruined room. Strong hands grasped her shoulders, pulling her clear of the debris field, and she found herself pressed against his solid chest as another volley of gunfire erupted from the darkness like thunder from a clear sky. "How many riders?" she gasped, fighting to clear her smoke-damaged throat. "4, possibly 5, he replied, already moving toward what remained of her back wall with the fluid grace of a predator. "They're circling like buzzards around carrion, trying to flush us into the open where they can finish this work properly. Why are you helping me?" The question tumbled from her lips before she could stop it. Raw, and desperate as a prayer. He paused, his obsidian eyes meeting hers in the dying firelight. "Because those men want a war between my people and yours," he said with quiet intensity that cut through the chaos around them. "They won't get it tonight, not while I draw breath." Through a gap in the collapsed wall, she glimpsed the orange glow of torches moving through the darkness, like malevolent spirits seeking souls to harvest. The harsh laughter of men who believed themselves hunters rather than hunted echoed across her ruined homestead. "Can you ride?" he asked, checking the loads in his Spencer carbine with practiced efficiency that spoke of long familiarity with violence and survival. The Spencer carbine carries a 7-round tube magazine and is worked by a lever action. "Do I have any choice in the matter?" Something that might have been admiration flickered across his features like sunlight on water. "No, you don't." He helped her to unsteady feet, her legs weak as a newborn colt's beneath her trembling form. The night air bit through her torn clothing like winter's teeth, raising gooseflesh along her exposed arms. But there was no time to search for warmer garments among the smoldering ruins of her former life. In one fluid motion, he lifted her onto his paint horse's broad back before swinging up behind her with the grace of someone born to the saddle. "Hold tight to my belt," he murmured against her ear. And then they were flying through the night like souls fleeing damnation itself. Hooves pounding against the hard-packed earth as bullets whined past their heads like angry hornets seeking blood. Alice clung to his waist with desperate strength, feeling the solid warmth of his body against her back as they raced toward the river willows. Behind them, shouts of frustration and rage echoed across the prairie as their pursuers realized their quarry had slipped the carefully prepared trap. A bullet grazed the warrior's ribs, tearing through buckskin and flesh, with a wet sound that made Alice's stomach lurch with sympathetic pain. She felt warm blood seeping through his shirt, smelled the copper tang mixing with smoke and horse sweat. But he made no sound of pain beyond a sharp intake of breath that spoke of iron self-control. The paint horse plunged through a screen of willow's branches, whipping at their faces as they entered the dense grove that bordered Rock Creek. Here the sounds of pursuit grew muffled and confused as their enemies struggled to follow their trail through the maze of vegetation and shadow. Only when they reached a hidden clearing where the creek formed a natural pool did he allow their mount to stop. The water's surface reflected the star-filled sky like obsidian glass, peaceful and serene. In stark contrast to the violence they just escaped, he slid down from the saddle with practiced grace before helping Alice to the ground. Her legs nearly buckled as the full impact of the night's events finally struck her like a physical blow. The loss of her home, her livelihood, very nearly her precious life. "Let me tend that wound," she said, reaching toward his blood-soaked side. He caught her wrist gently but firmly, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "I've endured far worse than this scratch." "From white men or Indians?" The question hung between them like smoke from a grass fire, heavy with implications neither was prepared to voice. In the distance, they could still hear the frustrated shouts of their pursuers growing fainter as the search moved away from the river. "Both," he said finally, releasing her wrist to withdraw a small leather pouch from his belt. He began tearing strips from his buckskin shirt with methodical efficiency. "Hold this against your arm where the fire kissed you." He pressed a folded cloth against her forearm, where she now realized a burn had blistered the skin during her escape from the flames. The pain hadn't registered before, lost in the greater shock of survival, but now it throbbed with each heartbeat like a brand pressed against her flesh. "You have a name?" she asked as he worked to bind her injury with surprising gentleness. "Takode," he replied without looking up from his task. "And you, Alice Morrison. I held legal deed to that land. They just burned to ash." His hands stilled for a moment, held past tense now. Unless that iron strong box beneath your hearth survived what they did to your home, it might have survived the flames. The box is solid iron buried deep beneath the kitchen stones. Even as she spoke, Alice felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her like that timber beam. But even if the papers survived, who's to say I'll live long enough to present them to any court? The brutal honesty of his assessment hit her like a physical blow. In the space of a few hours, she'd lost everything that had anchored her to this harsh but beautiful land, her home, her means of survival, very nearly her precious life. Now she sat beside a creek with a Lakota warrior whose motivations remained as mysterious as the shadows dancing around them. "Why were you at my place when the fire started?" she asked, needing to understand the coincidence that had saved her life. Wikasa moved to the creek's edge and cupped water in his hands, drinking deeply before answering. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I've been tracking those riders for 3 long days. They've been hitting homesteads all along this valley, burning out settlers and leaving evidence that points straight to my people. Your people didn't know." The single word carried absolute conviction. But someone with considerable resources wants it to appear that way. Someone who profits when neighbors turn against neighbors, when fear replaces clear thinking. Alice sank down on a fallen cottonwood log, feeling the full magnitude of her situation settling like cold lead in her stomach. Who would orchestrate such elaborate and cruel deception? Someone with money enough to purchase coal oil by the barrel and patience enough to plan this entire campaign with military precision. Someone who stands to gain considerably when settlers abandon their claims or sell cheap out of desperation. He settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool night air. Someone who understands that frightened folks make choices they'd never consider in calmer times. The gentle sound of moving water filled the silence between them, punctuated by the distant call of a nightbird and the whisper of wind through the willows. Despite everything, the fire, the chase, the uncertain future stretching ahead like an unmarked trail through hostile territory, Alice found herself oddly comforted by this stranger's steady presence. "You could have kept riding when you saw the flames," she said softly. "Could have let it burn and saved yourself considerable trouble and danger." "Could have," he agreed without hesitation. "Didn't? Why not?" He remained quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed far older than his years. "Because I've witnessed what happens when decent people stand aside and do nothing while evil flourishes unchecked. I've seen what fear can accomplish when folks stop thinking clearly and start running scared like spooked cattle." He met her eyes across the darkness. Tonight felt like a night for taking a stand, regardless of personal cost. 5 days earlier, when the morning sun had painted the eastern sky the color of ripe peaches, and the promise of another scorching day hung in the still air like a physical presence. Alice Morrison had believed her greatest concern was the handful of brown eggs she hoped to trade at the Rock Creek market. The drought had been merciless to everyone in the valley, leaving the creek running shallow and her vegetable garden withered, despite careful water rationing that left her constantly thirsty and perpetually worried about her livestock. But she'd been managing to survive the way frontier folks did when circumstances offered no alternative but grim perseverance and stubborn refusal to surrender to forces beyond their control. The settlement of Rock Creek sprawled along the banks of its namesake waterway, like a collection of sun-bleached bones, weathered smooth by the endless wind that swept down from the northern mountains, carrying the scent of pine and snow from heights that seemed impossibly distant in the suffocating heat of summer. False-fronted buildings lined the dusty main thoroughfare like actors on a stage. Murphy's General Store, with its creaking wooden sign that proclaimed the availability of everything from horseshoe nails to ladies' bonnets. The Starlight Saloon, where cowhands spent their hard-earned wages on rot-gut whiskey and faded dreams of better times. Dr. Felicity Morrison's medical practice, with its pristine white shingle that spoke of Eastern education and Western determination, and the small schoolhouse where Miss Serenity Walsh taught the children of settlers and miners with equal dedication and infinite patience. But it was the imposing brick bank that dominated the town's heart, like a hawk surveying its hunting grounds, its solid construction and expensive fixtures standing in stark contrast to the rough wooden buildings surrounding it. Thaddeus Blackwood's name was etched in gold letters above the entrance. Each character precisely formed and perfectly maintained a constant reminder that in Rock Creek, financial power spoke louder than prayers or promises or simple human decency. Alice had maintained the same exhausting routine for 3 years since proving up her homestead claim according to federal requirements, hitching her small wagon before dawn twice weekly, making the 4-mile journey along rutted tracks that passed for roads in this part of the territory, setting up her modest display of eggs and vegetables beside the general store, and hoping to earn enough coin to justify the expedition and keep her modest operation afloat for another week. The routine had become as familiar as breathing, as automatic as the rising and setting of the sun. But lately, that familiar pattern had been punctuated by uncomfortable encounters that left her skin crawling with unease and her nerves stretched taut as bowstrings ready to snap. Miss Morrison, Deputy Vernon Slate, approached her wagon with the measured pace of a man who understood that his authority was backed by gun leather and federal badge, his spurs jingling softly against the packed earth with each deliberate step. At 35, he carried himself with the swagger of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. His pale eyes, never quite meeting hers directly, but constantly evaluating, calculating, searching for weakness like a predator, selecting prey from a herd. "Deputy," Alice replied, keeping her voice carefully neutral, despite the way her pulse quickened at his approach. Experience had taught her that men like Slate fed on reactions, drawing strength from fear and discomfort, like vampires drawing blood from innocent victims. Fine morning for honest commerce, wouldn't you agree? His tone was conversational, almost friendly, but there was something underneath it that made Alice's skin crawl, a suggestion of violence held in check, of power that could be unleashed at a moment's notice. "Indeed, it is, Deputy. I hope you're finding everything to your satisfaction this morning." "Oh, I am. I truly am." Slate's smile held all the warmth of a snake preparing to strike, though I must say it's a terrible shame about the Henderson place. Alice's hands stilled on her egg crates, her fingers tightening involuntarily around the woven handles. The Henderson farm lay just 2 miles from her own claim, close enough that she should have seen smoke if it had burned during daylight hours. Close enough that she would have heard gunfire if there had been a fight. "I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning, Deputy. What about the Henderson place?" "Burned clear down to the foundation stones, I'm sorry to report. Nothing left but ash and bitter memories." His pale eyes fixed on her face, watching for her reaction with the intensity of a scientist observing an experiment. "Happened 3 nights past. Indians, most likely. They've been growing increasingly restless lately, what with all the discussion of new mining claims up near Fire Creek. The implication hung in the air between them, like the scent of sulfur after lightning strikes, heavy and ominous and impossible to ignore. Alice Morrison also lived alone on a claim that controlled the spring-fed creek, watering half the valley. In a drought year, access to reliable water meant the difference between prosperity and ruin, between life and death. I understood Mrs. Henderson traveled back east to live with her sister," Alice said carefully, choosing her words like a card sharp, selecting which cards to play. "After her husband passed last winter from pneumonia." "Did you indeed?" Slate's pale eyes finally met hers directly, and she glimpsed something cold and calculating lurking in their depths, like a snake coiled beneath a rock. Patient and deadly, and utterly without mercy. Curious how stories change in the telling, isn't it? But then, a woman living in isolation hears all manner of tales. Hard to distinguish truth from fear talking, especially when the nights grow long and the shadows start moving in ways that don't seem quite natural. Before Alice could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal her growing alarm, a new voice cut through the mounting tension like a blade through silk. Deputy Slate. Serenity Walsh approached from the direction of the schoolhouse, her dark skirts swirling around her ankles and her spine straight as a lodgepole pine, despite the early hour and oppressive heat. At 30, the school teacher had earned a reputation for speaking her mind regardless of who might take offense at her words, and her intelligent brown eyes missed very little of what transpired in their small community. Don't you have actual criminals to harass, deputy, or have you been reduced to intimidating women who sell eggs for an honest living? Slate's jaw tightened visibly, his hand drifting unconsciously toward his gun belt, but he touched his hat brim with exaggerated courtesy that fooled no one present. Miss Walsh, always a genuine pleasure to observe our dedicated educator, taking such personal interest in local affairs. Someone certainly should. Serenity replied coolly, moving to stand between Alice and the deputy like a shield made of determination and righteous anger. Especially when those affairs seem to involve spreading wild tales about Indian raids that nobody else claims to have witnessed firsthand. Careful, schoolmarm. Questions like that might make reasonable folks wonder exactly whose interests you're really serving. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable as a rattler's warning buzz, carrying the implicit promise of consequences for those who push too hard against the established order. In a town where Thaddeus Blackwood held mortgages on half the businesses and employment contracts for most of the remainder opposing his interests, could prove financially fatal. But Serenity held the deputy's gaze without flinching her chin, raised in defiance that spoke of principles stronger than fear. I serve the interests of truth, deputy. You might want to acquaint yourself with the concept. Slate's hand drifted closer to his revolver, the gesture subtle but unmistakable to anyone familiar with the language of frontier violence. But before the confrontation could escalate into something that would leave blood on the dusty street, a new voice interrupted with a weight of absolute authority. Vernon Thaddeus Blackwood himself emerged from the bank's shadowed entrance, his expensive Eastern suit and polished boots marking him as clearly as brands mark cattle. At 50, he carried himself with the supreme confidence of a man who'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient applications of money or violence. His silver hair perfectly groomed and his manicured hands speaking of a life lived far from physical labor. I believe Sheriff Patterson requires your assistance over at the freight office. Something about a shipment that arrived significantly short of its manifest. The dismissal was politely phrased but absolutely final, carrying the unspoken authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Slate touched his hat brim once more and stalked away, his spurs jingling with barely controlled frustration as he disappeared around the corner of Murphy's store. Miss Morrison, Blackwood said, his tone carefully modulated to project paternal concern rather than naked threat. I trust Deputy Slate wasn't bothering you about anything of genuine importance. Nothing I cannot handle adequately, Alice replied, though her voice emerged less steady than she'd hoped, betraying the fear that Slate's veiled threats had awakened in her chest. Of course not. Independent women such as yourself always seem to discover methods to handle difficult situations. His smile was colder than winter wind off the high peaks, carrying no warmth or genuine friendliness, though I imagine it becomes quite lonely out there on your isolated claim, especially with all these unfortunate incidents befalling remote homesteads throughout the valley. I manage my affairs perfectly well, Mr. Blackwood. I'm entirely certain you do. But should circumstances ever change, should you ever find yourself in need of assistance, or perhaps interested in selling, I'd be delighted to discuss mutually beneficial terms. His pale eyes held hers with the intensity of a hawk studying a mouse. I pay fair market prices for quality land, particularly property with reliable water access, such as yours. The offer sounded reasonable on its surface, but Alice had heard enough stories about Blackwood's fair market prices to recognize the trap hidden within honeyed words. Homesteaders who sold to him rarely received sufficient compensation to establish themselves elsewhere, and those who refused his generous offers often found themselves facing an escalating series of increasingly unpleasant incidents. Cattle mysteriously wandering onto their property and getting shot for trespassing. Essential tools disappearing from locked sheds. Wells becoming mysteriously contaminated with alkali or worse. I appreciate your generous offer, Mr. Blackwood, but I have no interest in selling my claim. No, naturally not. Why would you consider such a thing? His expression remained pleasant, but something cold flickered behind his eyes, like lightning behind storm clouds. Young woman like yourself, filled with dreams and determination to succeed against all odds. He paused, letting his gaze drift over her modest display of eggs and withered vegetables, taking in the mended patches on her dress and the worn leather of her boots. When he looked back at her face, his smile had taken on a predatory quality that made her stomach clench with instinctive fear. Just remember, Miss Morrison, dreams don't deflect bullets, and determination won't extinguish fires set by hostile hands. He touched his expensive hat and strolled back toward the bank with unhurried confidence, leaving Alice and Serenity standing in the street with morning sun beating down on their shoulders and the taste of dust and fear thick as molasses in their mouths. That constituted a direct threat, Serenity said quietly, once Blackwood had disappeared through the bank's polished doors. I'm well aware of that fact. Alice began loading her unsold eggs back into their wooden crates with hands that trembled slightly, despite her efforts at self-control. The question becomes, what exactly am I supposed to do about such threats? You could sell your claim, accept whatever he offers, and attempt to start over somewhere else, somewhere beyond his considerable reach. Alice shook her head with firm determination that surprised even herself. That land represents everything I possess in this world. My husband saved for 3 long years to purchase that claim, worked himself into an early grave, proving it up according to federal requirements. I won't simply hand it over to men like Blackwood because they're too lazy or corrupt to earn their own prosperity through honest labor. Then you'd better prepare yourself for whatever evil they plan to unleash next. As if summoned by her ominous words, a new figure approached from the direction of the livery stable. Amos Fletcher resembled a scarecrow brought to life, all sharp angles and weathered skin stretched over prominent bones, but his pale eyes held genuine kindness, and his calloused hands bore witness to decades of honest frontier labor. "Morning, ladies," he said, touching the brim of his worn hat with courteous respect. "Alice, I was wondering if you might could use some assistance with that fence line running between our properties." The offer represented typical frontier neighborliness, practical assistance offered without expectation of monetary payment. The kind of mutual aid that had helped settlers survive in harsh country since the first wagon trains rolled westward toward sunset and opportunity. But it also represented something more significant, a quiet declaration that she wasn't as isolated as Blackwood and his hired enforcers wanted her to believe. "Now that's extraordinarily kind of you, Amos, but I couldn't possibly ask you to. Weren't asking was offering." He interrupted with a crooked grin that matched his twice-broken nose. "Besides, good fences make good neighbors, as they say, and I'd much rather have you for a neighbor than whoever Blackwood might install if something genuinely unfortunate were to befall your claim. The meaning was crystal clear. Like Serenity, Amos had observed which direction the wind was blowing and chosen his side accordingly. In a community where most folks kept their heads down and their opinions to themselves, such gestures carried weight far beyond their simple appearance. "I would be genuinely grateful for your assistance," Alice said finally. "Excellent. I'll bring those posts over first thing tomorrow morning, if that suits your schedule." As Amos headed back toward his own wagon, Serenity laid a gentle hand on Alice's shoulder. "You possess more allies than you realize," she said softly. "Don't forget that truth when darkness comes calling at your door." But friendship, Alice reflected as she drove her wagon home along the dusty, rutted track that passed for a road in this remote corner of the territory, provided poor defense against bullets and arson. And as the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, she couldn't shake the growing certainty that darkness was already gathering on the horizon, patient as a buzzard circling wounded prey. The next 2 days passed in deceptive tranquility, with Amos Fletcher arriving as promised to help repair her fence line. Working together under the blazing sun, they replaced rotted posts and stretched new wire while discussing everything from the weather to the territorial election scheduled for fall. It felt almost normal, this easy camaraderie born of shared labor and mutual respect. But Alice noticed things that troubled her. The way Amos kept glancing toward the road, as if expecting unwelcome visitors of the rifle he kept propped against the fence while they worked. The careful way he positioned himself to watch all approaches to her property. He was expecting trouble, and his vigilance did nothing to ease her growing sense of impending disaster. On the second evening, as they were finishing the last section of fence near the creek, Amos paused in his work and looked directly at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "Alice, I need to tell you something that ain't easy to say." She set down her hammer and gave him her full attention, seeing worry etched in every line of his weathered face. "My brother Joe came by last night, the one who hauls supplies up to Fire Creek Mine." Amos wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "He's been seeing things up there that don't sit right with him. Deliveries that don't match the manifest, men coming and going at odd hours, supplies being stored in places they got no business being." "What kind of supplies?" "Coal oil, mostly barrels and barrels of it, more than any mine operation would ever need. And other things wore paint feathers, the kind of items you might use if you wanted to make folks think Indians were causing trouble." Alice felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Here was confirmation of what Wicasa had suspected. Concrete evidence that someone was orchestrating the raids that had been blamed on his people. "Has your brother told anyone else about this?" Amos shook his head. "Joe's scared, and rightfully so. Men who work for Blackwood have a way of disappearing when they ask too many questions or see too much of what they shouldn't. But he's got family to think about, a grandson he's raising since his daughter died of the fever last year. Or then why tell me? Because you're next on their list, and Joe knows it. He's seen the maps in Blackwood's office, heard the discussions about which properties need to be cleared. Your place is marked in red ink, Alice. They're coming for you, and soon." The attack came that very night, swift and merciless, as a prairie storm born from clear skies. Alice had spent the evening reading by lamplight, one of the few books she'd managed to salvage from her previous life in Ohio, a collection of poetry that had belonged to her mother. The familiar words offered little comfort in her current circumstances, but they provided a precious connection to happier times, to a world where women could afford the luxury of literature instead of constantly worrying about a mere survival. But she couldn't concentrate on the verses, couldn't lose herself in their beauty as she once had. Amos's warning echoed in her mind like a death knell, and every sound outside the hoot of an owl. The rustle of wind through the corn made her jump like a spooked horse. The first warning came from her chickens. The birds had been restless throughout the evening, clucking and fussing in their wooden coop, with an agitation that spoke of predators prowling nearby. Alice had checked on them twice after sunset, finding nothing more threatening than raccoon tracks in the dust beside their enclosure. But their continued distress should have warned her that far more dangerous predators were moving through the darkness beyond her homestead's boundaries. She'd been dozing fitfully in her rocking chair when the distinctive sharp odor of coal oil reached her nostrils. That unmistakable scent that meant only one thing. In a world where fire served as both salvation and destroyer. By the time she was fully awake and moving toward the window to investigate the source, orange light was already dancing against the glass, like demons celebrating their victory. They'd surrounded her modest house like a pack of wolves, moving with the practiced coordination of men who performed this particular type of violence before. Through the window, she caught glimpses of figures on horseback, their faces concealed by bandanas, and their heads adorned with what appeared to be feathers and war paint applied in theatrical patterns. To any observer watching from a safe distance, they would look exactly like the Indian raiders, who'd been blamed for the recent string of homestead burnings throughout the valley. But Alice had lived on the frontier long enough to recognize crude theater when she witnessed it firsthand. Genuine Lakota warriors didn't announce their presence with war whoops that sounded suspiciously like intoxicated cowboys attempting to imitate what they'd seen in traveling Wild West shows. And they certainly didn't splash coal oil around like men who possessed an unlimited supply waiting back at the general store. She grabbed her deceased husband's old Sharps rifle from its place above the stone fireplace, checking to ensure it was properly loaded before moving toward the back door. The Sharps is a single-shot bridge loader, one round at a time, accurate and punishing. If she could reach the creek bottom, she might be able to lose herself among the willows until dawn brought potential rescue. But as she eased the heavy wooden door open, a rifle shot splintered the frame mere inches from her head, sending wooden splinters flying like shrapnel. "Come on out, lady." The voice carried a distinctly American accent, despite the exaggerated war cries echoing around her small yard. "Make this situation easy on yourself and everyone involved." Alice slammed the door and threw the iron bolt, knowing it would purchase her, perhaps minutes at most, before they decided to end this charade and burn her alive in her own home. Through the front window, she could see flames climbing the walls of her chicken coop. The terrified birds screaming as they burned alive in their wooden prison. The sight filled her with cold rage that burned hotter than the fires consuming her property. She wasn't going to die cowering in her own home like a rabbit trapped in its burrow by hunting hounds. Moving to the front window, she smashed out the glass with her rifle butt and took careful aim at the nearest mounted figure. The Sharps kicked like an angry mule when she squeezed the trigger, and the deep satisfaction of watching the man tumble from his saddle was worth the bruise it left on her shoulder. But her small victory proved short-lived. Additional riders emerged from the darkness like materializing spirits, and the acrid smell of coal oil grew stronger as they splashed it against the walls of her house with methodical thoroughness. She had perhaps 60 seconds before the entire structure became a raging inferno, trapping her inside like a caged animal. The roof caught first, sending cascades of sparks and burning debris raining down into the single room that had served as her sanctuary for 3 hard but hopeful years. She attempted to reach the back door again, but a massive burning beam crashed down, blocking her path and filling the air with choking smoke that seared her lungs with each desperate breath. That's when the larger support beam fell, pinning her beneath its crushing weight and trapping her in a world of flame and shadow, where each breath might be her last. Her final coherent thought before consciousness fled was that she'd failed. Failed to save her home, failed to honor her husband's memory, failed to prove that a determined woman could survive alone in this unforgiving wilderness. Then merciful darkness claimed her, and she knew nothing more until she woke to find a Lakota warrior pressed against her in the most intimate embrace of her entire life. Now sitting beside Rock Creek, with the acrid taste of smoke still sharp in her throat, like a brand upon her tongue, Alice found herself studying the man who'd risked his own life to save hers. Wassa moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd grown up on horseback, every gesture economical and purposeful. His buckskin clothing showed the careful maintenance of quality craftsmanship designed for function rather than display. And his weapons bore the meticulous care of a man who understood his life might depend on their absolute reliability. "But we need to reach somewhere safe," Wakasa said, checking his weapons with professional thoroughness. "Those riders will return at first light, searching for tracks to follow. Where could we possibly go? The entire town fears Blackwood and his hired enforcers. Even folks who might wish to help won't risk their own families for strangers. There's one person who might prove willing." He returned to her side, his wet buck-skinned shirt clinging to the muscled contours of his chest in ways that made Alice's breath catch. Despite their desperate circumstances, Dr. Felicity Morrison, she took a sacred oath to heal people, and from everything I've observed, she takes that commitment seriously, regardless of personal consequences. Alice had heard the stories circulating about Rock Creek's female physician, a woman who'd received formal medical training back east before traveling west to establish her practice in defiance of social convention and common sense. Some folks whispered the doctor. Morrison's healing skills bordered on the miraculous, while others muttered darkly about the propriety of any woman practicing medicine at all. But she'd never turned away a patient who genuinely needed help, regardless of their ability to pay or the color of their skin. In a community where most people chose sides based on profit rather than principle, such integrity was rarer than gold dust and considerably more valuable. "Can we trust her completely? Can we afford not to take that risk?" Wassa countered with frontier pragmatism. "Right now, she's the only qualified physician within 50 mi, which makes her the only person capable of documenting our injuries properly. Legal evidence that will stand up in court, not just hearsay and speculation." The logic was unassailable, but Alice couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking directly into another, carefully prepared trap. Every potential ally they might approach was also a possible liability. Every friend a potential enemy in disguise. In this deadly game where the stakes were measured in human lives, a single wrong decision could prove fatal for everyone involved. But remaining beside the creek wouldn't solve anything, and dawn would bring fresh dangers regardless of their ultimate decision. With Wakasa's steady assistance, she climbed to unsteady feet and prepared to face whatever challenges awaited them in the darkness ahead. Dawn remained more than an hour away when they reached the outskirts of Rock Creek, approaching Dr. Morrison's medical practice through the maze of ramshackle shanties and improvised shelters that housed the town's poorest residents. The air hung thick with the mingled odors of coal smoke and unwashed humanity, punctuated by occasional whiffs of rotting garbage and human waste that spoke of lives lived perpetually on the edge of desperation. Here lived the Chinese laborers who'd stayed after the railroad construction ended the Mexican families who'd fled north from revolution and poverty. The freed slaves seeking better opportunities in territories where the color of their skin might matter less than their willingness to work. These were the forgotten people of Rock Creek, invisible to the respectable citizens who conducted business on Main Street, but essential to the community's survival nonetheless. Wikasa left his paint horse tied behind Wong's Chinese laundry, where the animal would blend invisibly among the various mules and donkeys that served this forgotten corner of town. He helped Alice down from the saddle with hands that lingered at her waist longer than strictly necessary. A gesture that sent unexpected warmth coursing through her, despite the pre-dawn chill that bit through her torn clothing like winter's teeth. "Stay close to me," he murmured, drawing his bone-handled knife and holding it low against his thigh, where it wouldn't catch what little light filtered down from the star-filled sky. "If something goes wrong, head directly for the livery stable and find a man named Joe Fletcher. Tell him Wassa sent you and needs immediate assistance." Joe Fletcher, any relation to Amos. His older brother operates supply runs to the mining camps, but he's also been helping folks travel the INAID network of safe routes northward to freedom. At her surprised expression, he added quietly, "There are more battles being fought in this territory than simple cattle rustling and claim jumping. Some fights are worth risking everything to win." They moved through narrow alleys like ghosts, seeking redemption, avoiding the main thoroughfare where early rising citizens might spot them and carry word to hostile ears. The back streets of Rock Creek told a different story than the false fronts on Main Street. Here were the privies and garbage heaps, the broken dreams and shattered hopes that prosperity couldn't quite conceal. Dr. Morrison's practice occupied a modest wooden structure behind Murphy's general store, identified only by a simple painted sign reading F. Morrison, M.D. in neat black letters that spoke of Eastern education and Western determination. The building appeared dark and shuttered, but when Wicasa tapped softly on the back door with careful rhythm, 3 quick taps paused 2 more. It opened almost immediately. Dr. Felicity Morrison stood framed in the doorway, a woman in her early 40s with steel-gray hair and intelligent brown eyes that missed very little. She wore a plain dark dress covered by a spotless white apron that bore the inevitable stains of her demanding profession blood. Iodine and other substances that marked her as someone who dealt regularly with human suffering. "I thought I detected the scent of smoke in the night air," she said quietly, stepping aside to allow them entry into her sanctuary, along with considerable quantities of blood. Quite a lot of both, actually. Her examining room was spartanly furnished, but scrupulously clean with medical instruments arranged on white cloth, like soldiers prepared for battle, and the sharp medicinal smell of carbolic acid hanging in the air, like incense in a church dedicated to healing rather than prayer. Gas lamps provided steady illumination, and their flames dancing behind glass chimneys that cast moving shadows on the walls. She lit additional lamps with steady hands and gestured for Alice to seat herself on the examining table that dominated the room's center. "I assume this isn't a social call at this unusual hour," the doctor said, beginning her examination with gentle but thorough hands that spoke of years spent treating frontier injuries. "The burn on your arm shows characteristics of secondary damage, probably caused by sparks or flying debris rather than direct flame contact. The contusions along your rib cage suggest you were trapped beneath something considerably heavy for an extended period. How long were you unconscious?" "I honestly don't know. Perhaps an hour, maybe longer." Alice winced as skilled fingers probed the tender spots along her rib cage with professional precision. It's difficult to estimate time when you're trapped in a burning building and expecting to die at any moment. Understandable. The human mind has ways of protecting itself from trauma that exceed our ability to measure. Dr. Morrison turned her attention to Wicasa, who had remained standing near the door, like a sentry guarding against unknown threats. "And you, that blood decorating your shirt isn't merely decorative, I assume. Bullet grace, nothing life-threatening. Allow me to make that determination for myself." Her tone borked absolutely no argument, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in medical matters. After a moment's hesitation, Mikasa removed his buckskin shirt and permitted her to examine the wound with professional thoroughness. "You're fortunate beyond measure," she said, cleaning the wound with alcohol that made even the stoic warrior cease. "Another inch to the left, and that bullet would have punctured your lung, leaving you to drown in your own blood. As matters stand, you'll have an interesting scar to remember this night, by but nothing that will impair your ability to function. As she worked cleaning and bandaging their various injuries with practiced efficiency born of long experience, Alice found herself stealing glances at Wasa's bare torso. His bronze skin bore the map of a life lived constantly on the edge of violence. Some scars clearly from bullets, others from blades or animal claws, creating a visual history of survival against overwhelming odds. But it was the unexpected gentleness of his hands that surprised her most deeply. When Dr. Morrison needed him to hold Alice steady during a particularly painful portion of her treatment, his touch was light as butterfly wings, offering comfort and support, without demand or expectation of anything in return. "There," the doctor announced, finally securing the last bandage with professional satisfaction. "You'll both survive, though I'd strongly recommend rest and avoiding any additional midnight adventures for the immediate future." "That may not prove possible," Wakasa said with steely resolve, pulling his shirt back on despite the fresh bloodstains that marked it. "Dr. Morrison, what we're about to tell you could place you in considerable personal danger, if you'd prefer not to know the details." "Young man, I've been practicing medicine in frontier towns for 15 years. She interrupted with steely determination that balked no argument. "If I was afraid of danger, I would have remained in Boston and married the respectable banker my father selected for me." She fixed him with a stern glare that could have cut glass. "What exactly happened to bring you both to my door at this ungodly hour?" They told her everything. The systematic campaign of fake Indian raids, the deliberate burning of isolated homesteads, the mounting evidence pointing toward a coordinated conspiracy designed to drive out legitimate settlers and seize their property for a fraction of its true value. Dewar Morrison listened without interruption, her expression growing progressively grimmer with each damning detail they revealed. When they finished their account, she was quiet for a long moment, her hands clasped behind her back as she paced the small room like a caged animal. Finally, she turned to face them with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal outrage. "I've been wondering about those raids," she admitted, her voice carrying the weight of suppressed anger. "Far too convenient, far too theatrical for genuine warfare. Real war parties don't typically leave calling cards behind to advertise their involvement." She moved to her desk and withdrew a leather-bound ledger thick with entries. "I've been treating an unusual number of burn victims during recent weeks, always with identical stories, sudden Indian attacks, everything lost families forced to sell their claims for whatever pittance they could negotiate." "To whom?" "If I may ask," Alice inquired, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Thaddeus Blackwood in every single case. Remarkable how he always seems to have ready cash available, precisely when desperate families need to sell quickly and without the luxury of competitive bidding." She opened the ledger and began reading from her careful notes. "The Henderson family lost their claim 2 weeks ago, sold to Blackwood for $50. The Kowalskis burned out last month, accepted $35 for land worth 10 times that amount. The Murphy brothers, their ranch went up in flames. 3 weeks passed, and they took whatever Blackwood offered, rather than face another winter with nothing." Alice felt sick listening to the catalog of human misery, each entry representing lives destroyed and dreams crushed in service of one man's greed. All of them blamed on Indian raids, every single one. And in each case, the survivors were too traumatized or too frightened to question the official version of events. They took what money they could get and fled the territory as quickly as possible. The sound of multiple horses approaching through the alley outside brought their conversation to an abrupt and ominous halt. Dr. Morrison moved to the window and peered carefully through a gap in the heavy curtains, her face tightening with concern as she observed the scene unfolding in the pre-dawn darkness. Deputy Slate accompanied by 5 other armed men, she reported in a whisper that barely carried across the small room. "They're conducting a systematic building-by-building search, checking every structure methodically." Wicassa was already in motion, checking his weapons and calculating angles of potential escape with tactical precision born of long experience with hostile situations. Back door opens into an alley that connects directly with the main street. They'll have positioned men to cover it by now. Dr. Morrison's mind was working as rapidly as theirs, analyzing possibilities and discarding those that offered poor odds of survival. There's a root cellar beneath the floor, but it's barely large enough for one person, and they'll certainly search it if they conduct a thorough investigation. The sound of boots on wooden steps announced that their time for planning had run out. Heavy fists pounded on the front door with the authority of badges and guns, followed by Deputy Slate's voice, raised in official command. "Dr. Morrison, open this door in the name of territorial law." "I'm coming," the doctor called back, but her hands were already moving to extinguish the gas lamps, plunging the room into darkness. "There's a hidden space behind the medicine cabinet," she whispered urgently. "It opens into the wall cavity between buildings. You can reach the alley through the carpenter shop next door." But before they could move toward the concealed entrance, the front door exploded inward without warning. Splinters of seasoned wood flying across the room like shrapnel as Deputy Slate and his men burst through with weapons drawn and ready for violence. The deputy's pale eyes swept the room with predatory intensity, taking in the medical supplies, blood-stained bandages, and unmistakable evidence of recent emergency treatment. "Well, well, well," Slate drawled, with the satisfaction of a hunter who cornered his prey, his revolver trained steadily on Wicassa's chest. "Dr. Morrison, conducting business at unusual hours, I observe. I'm a physician deputy. Medical emergencies don't respect conventional business hours or social propriety." Her voice remained steady despite the multiple weapons pointed in her direction, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with life and death situations. "Is there something specific I can help you with at this ungodly hour?" "As a matter of fact, there is. We're searching for a dangerous Indian who attacked an innocent homestead earlier tonight, murdered a defenseless woman, and burned her property to the ground in typical savage fashion. His smile held all the warmth of a snake preparing to strike. We have reason to believe he might seek medical attention for wounds received during his cowardly assault." "I haven't treated any Indians tonight," Dr. Morrison replied with technical accuracy. She'd treated a Lakota warrior, but Slate hadn't been specific about tribal distinctions in his questioning. "What about her?" One of Slate's companions gestured toward Alice with his rifle barrel, the weapon's muzzle never wavering from its target. "She looks like she's been playing with fire herself." Miss Henderson sought treatment for burns suffered while attempting to save her belongings from an accidental house fire, the doctor replied smoothly, constructing plausible lies with the skill of someone who'd learned to protect vulnerable patients from hostile authorities. Tragic situation, losing one's home to careless accident. It was a clever deception, but Alice could see that Slate wasn't buying the fabricated story. His pale eyes moved between the three of them, like a predator scenting blood, searching for the weakness that would provide an excuse to begin shooting and ask questions later. "Curious thing about that Henderson fire," he said with false conversational casualness that fooled no one present. "We discovered tracks leading away from the ruins. Indian pony tracks heading south toward Rock Creek, like someone fleeing the scene of a particularly heinous crime." "People see what they expect to see," Wicassa said quietly, speaking for the first time since the deputies had invaded their sanctuary, especially when they're actively looking for someone to blame for their own failures. Slate's revolver swung toward him with deadly intent, the hammer already cocked and ready to send a bullet through his heart. Indian Buck thinks he's qualified to offer opinions about law enforcement, does he? Perhaps you'd like to share those enlightened views down at the jail, where we can discuss them more thoroughly." He's under my doctor's bluff and community authority, Dr. Morrison interjected firmly, stepping between the weapon and her patient with courage that took Alice's breath away. Federal law protects patients receiving legitimate medical treatment from harassment by local authorities. Your patient Slate's harsh laughter sounded like millstones grinding grain to powder. Doctor, this savage just confessed to burning homesteads and murdering innocent white women. Medical protection doesn't extend to shielding known criminals from justice. The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge violence, hanging in the air like smoke from a grass fire, ready to explode into devastating conflagration. Alice could see Wikasa calculating odds and distances, preparing to fight despite being outnumbered and outgunned by professional killers. But before anyone could initiate the bloodshed that seemed inevitable, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Deputy Slate Joe Fletcher appeared in the doorway, his grizzled frame backlit by the growing dawn, and his weathered hands gripping a pitchfork with casual familiarity that suggested extensive experience using farm tools as weapons. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of guilt, a moment of hesitation that Alice caught but couldn't quite interpret. Official business, Joe. Nothing that concerns honest citizens like yourself. Might have to disagree with that particular assessment. Joe stepped into the room, but his movement seemed oddly reluctant, as if he were fighting some internal battle that none of them could see. You see, I was checking my livestock before dawn, as is my custom, and I happened to notice some mighty interesting tracks on my property. Alice noticed his hands trembling slightly on the pitchfork handle, and something cold settled in her stomach like a lead weight. There was something wrong here, something that didn't fit with what she knew about Joe Fletcher's character from her conversations with his brother Amos. Boot prints, not moccasins. Joe continued, but his voice lacked conviction, carrying none of the certainty that should accompany eyewitness testimony. White men's horses shot with iron, not Indian ponies running barefoot. He paused, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. At least that's what I thought I saw. The hesitation in his voice was like a physical blow to Alice's chest. She saw the truth in his eyes now, of the desperate shame of a man who'd been backed into an impossible corner and forced to choose between betraying strangers and protecting his own family. You thought you saw Slate pressed, sensing weakness like a sharking blood in the water. Joe's shoulders slumped in defeat, the pitchfork suddenly seeming too heavy for his weathered hands to support. I might have been mistaken. These old eyes ain't what they used to be. And in the dark, he looked directly at Alice, and she saw the anguish in his expression, the pain of a decent man forced to do indecent things. I'm sorry, he whispered so quietly only she could hear. They've got my grandson. Said they'd hurt little Tommy if I didn't. The betrayal hit Alice like a physical blow, but even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she found herself understanding Joe's impossible position. How could she blame a man for choosing his family's safety over the lives of strangers? In his place, wouldn't she have made the same terrible choice? That's better, Slate said with savage satisfaction, his pale eyes gleaming with the triumph of a predator who'd successfully cornered his prey. Now about these dangerous fugitives hiding in the good doctor's establishment. But Joe Fletcher wasn't finished. Something hardened in his weathered features, some last vestige of pride and honor that refused to be completely crushed by circumstances beyond his control. They've got my grandson, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear his voice, carrying the pain of a grandfather's love twisted into a weapon against innocent people. Little Tommy Fletcher, age 7. They took him from his bed last night and said they'd kill him if I didn't cooperate with their demands. The admission hung in the air like a thunderclap, transforming the entire dynamic of the confrontation in an instant. Even Slatesman looked uncomfortable with this revelation. Threatening children crossed a line that even hardened killers often refused to cross. "You're talking nonsense, old man," Slate said. But there was less conviction in his voice now, uncertainty flickering behind his pale eyes like candle flame in a draft. "Am I?" Joe's voice grew stronger, fed by righteous anger and grandfatherly love that burned brighter than his fear. "Then, why don't we ride over to my place right now and check on Tommy? See if he's safe in his bed where he should be at this hour." The challenge caught Slate off guard, forcing him to confront the logical implications of his own denials. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his features as he calculated odds and considered consequences. Then his expression hardened again, and Alice knew they were all about to die, regardless of what happened next. But Joe Fletcher had one more surprise in store for everyone present. With a roar of grandfatherly fury that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, he swung the pitchfork in a wide arc that caught one of Slate's men across the chest, sending him stumbling backward into his companions with blood streaming from 3 parallel wounds. In the confusion that followed, Wikasa moved like lightning, his knife finding the throat of another deputy, while Alice grabbed the fallen man's rifle with hands that moved faster than conscious thought. The examining room erupted in chaos as men fought and died in the confined space, the air filled with gunpowder smoke and the wet sounds of violence that no amount of civilization could completely erase from the human experience. Dr. Morrison pressed herself against the wall, clutching her medical bag like a shield, while bullets splintered wood and shattered glass around her with deadly randomness. When the smoke finally cleared and the last echoes of gunfire faded into morning silence, 3 of Slate's men lay dead or dying on the blood-stained floor. The deputy himself had taken a bullet through the shoulder, but was still alive, his pale eyes burning with hatred and pain that transformed his face into a mask of pure malevolence. "This isn't over," he gasped through gritted teeth, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth as he struggled to remain conscious. "Blackwood will hunt you down like the animals you are. He has resources you can't imagine, connections that reach all the way to the territorial capital." Maybe Joe Fletcher said, binding his own wounded arm with strips torn from his shirt while keeping his rifle trained on the fallen deputy. "But first, you're going to tell us exactly where you're holding my grandson." The old man's voice carried a promise of violence that made even the wounded deputy flinch. And in that moment, Alice realized that Joe Fletcher's betrayal had actually been the beginning of their salvation. A desperate gambit that had allowed him to position himself perfectly for the moment when he could strike back against the men who threatened his family. It had been a dangerous game, and it had very nearly cost them all their lives. But Joe's willingness to sacrifice his own reputation to save his grandson had ultimately given them the opening they needed to fight back. The mining camp Slate admitted finally pain and blood loss, making him more talkative than pride would normally allow. "Blackwood's got the boy at Fire Creek along with anyone else who might cause trouble." Alice felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place like the mechanism of a well-made watch. Fire Creek Mine wasn't just a source of gold. It was Blackwood's fortress, his base of operations, where he could hold hostages and store evidence away from prying eyes. "Then that's where we're going," she said with grim determination that surprised even herself. "It's a trap," Dr. Morrison warned her medical training, making her naturally cautious about sending wounded people into additional danger. "He's drawing you exactly where he wants you." Probably agreed with the pragmatism of someone who'd survived by making hard choices under impossible circumstances. But sometimes walking into a trap is the only way to spring it from the inside. As they prepared to leave the blood-soaked examining room behind, Dr. Morrison pulled Alice aside with urgent intensity. "There's something you need to know," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "I've been working with the territorial authorities for months, documenting Blackwood's crimes and gathering evidence of his conspiracy. If you don't return by dawn tomorrow, I have orders to ride to Fort Collins and bring back federal marshals with full authority to investigate this situation. Travel between Fort Collins and the Creek settlements takes a hard day and a half on horseback. 2. If the weather turns, supply wagons need longer. Alice felt a surge of hope, stronger than anything she'd experienced since awakening in her burning home. They weren't going into this completely alone. There was a backup plan, a safety net that might save them all if their mission failed. "Give us until sunrise," Alice said, gripping the doctor's hand with fierce gratitude. "If we haven't returned by then, I'll ride like the devil himself is chasing me." Dr. Morrison promised with the conviction of someone who'd never broken her word. "And I'll bring enough federal authority to clean out this nest of vipers once and for all." The trail to Fire Creek Mine wound through terrain that seemed carved by malevolent gods intent on testing human endurance to its absolute limits. Twisted canyons where sunlight never penetrated the shadow depths, boulder fields capable of concealing entire armies, razor-sharp ridges that sliced the horizon like broken glass, reflecting hellish light from a sun that seemed determined to bake the life from everything beneath its merciless gaze. This was country that humbled strong men and killed those foolish enough to underestimate its countless dangers, where a single careless step could result in a fall that would echo for long seconds before ending in merciful silence. It was land that had never been meant for human habitation, a wilderness so harsh and unforgiving that even the native peoples who'd called it home for countless generations treated it with the respect due to a sleeping predator. But now they rode through this desolate landscape with desperate purpose, driven by the knowledge that innocent lives hung in the balance and the time was running out with each passing hour. Joe Fletcher led the way. Despite his wounded arm, his intimate knowledge of the mountain trails proving invaluable as they navigated passages that would have been impossible to find without an experienced guide. Behind him rode Wicasa and Alice, their horses, picking careful footing along paths that barely qualified as game trails. Each step testing both animal and rider as they climbed ever higher into the thin air of the high country. The sun climbed steadily overhead, its heat becoming a physical presence that pressed down on them like a blacksmith's forge, while their water supplies dwindled with alarming speed. By midday, they were forced to rest in whatever shade they could find. Their horses lathered with sweat and breathing hard in the oxygen-starved atmosphere. Alice's lips were cracked and bleeding despite the water they'd carefully rationed, and her body ached from the constant tension of staying in the saddle on such treacherous terrain. "Tell me about your family," Alice said, as they sheltered beneath an overhanging rock that provided blessed relief from the sun's relentless assault. She sought some connection beyond their shared danger, some way to understand the man who'd risked everything to save her life. Wassa was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the distant peaks that rose like jagged teeth against the cloudless sky. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and older wisdom. "My father died fighting the cavalry at Little Bighorn," he said. Finally, each word chosen with the care of someone who'd learned that words could wound as deeply as bullets. "He believed the old ways could survive if we fought hard enough, if we proved we wouldn't be driven from the land our ancestors had walked for countless generations." Alice remained silent, sensing that he needed to tell this story in his own way and his own time. "My mother passed 2 winters ago from the lung sickness that followed the cavalry's destruction of our winter food stores. She died coughing up blood, cursing the white soldiers who condemned her people to starvation." His voice grew softer, more distant. "I have a sister, Katari, who works at the mission school now, trying to learn the white man's ways so she can survive in a world that no longer has room for ours. And I have a younger cousin who reminds me too much of myself at that age, angry at the world and looking for someone to blame for all the injustices we've suffered. Is that why you help people like me to prove not all conflicts have to end in bloodshed? Maybe. Or maybe I just don't like seeing innocent folks suffer for other men's greed. He looked at her then, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression. Something that spoke of loneliness and loss that matched her own. What about you? What brought you to this godforsaken country? Alice found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected, sharing memories and pain that she'd kept locked away since her husband's death. Thomas dreamed of owning land, of building something lasting that would survive long after we were gone. He saved every penny for 3 years to buy that claim, worked from dawn to dusk in other men's fields so we could afford the filing fees and the supplies we'd need to prove it up. She paused, remembering the hope in his eyes when they'd first seen their homestead, the way he talked about the children they'd raised there, and the legacy they'd leave behind. He worked himself to death, proving that claim, breaking his back, clearing stones from fields that seemed determined to grow nothing but rocks and heartbreak. The doctor said it was his heart, but I knew better. It was the land itself that killed him, demanding more than any man could give, and then taking everything anyway. And yet you stayed. Why? She met his gaze steadily, seeing understanding there that she'd never found in the eyes of other men. At first, because leaving would mean his sacrifice meant nothing. But now she hesitated, not sure how to put her changing feelings into words. Now, I'm not sure if I'm fighting for his memory or for something new entirely. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither was quite ready to voice. Then, Weir reached out and touched her hand briefly, a gesture of comfort that sent warmth through her exhausted body, like whiskey on a winter night. "We should move," he said softly. But his eyes lingered on her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Still have hours of hard riding ahead, and the sun won't wait for us to catch our breath." The afternoon wore on with brutal monotony, each hour bringing fresh challenges as the trail grew ever more treacherous. They crossed streams that ran ice-cold despite the heat, their horses slipping on moss-covered rocks that could easily break a leg or send rider and mount tumbling into boulder-strewn ravines. They navigated cliff faces where the path was barely wide enough for a single horse, with nothing but empty air and certain death waiting for anyone foolish enough to look down. But gradually, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they began to catch glimpses of their destination. Fire Creek Valley spread below them like a wound in the earth, with wooden buildings connected by rickety walkways and massive piles of mine tailings marking where tons of rock had been processed and discarded in the endless search for precious metals. There, Joe pointed with his good arm toward a thin column of smoke rising from the main complex. "That's where they'll be holding Tommy along with anyone else who's caused Blackwood trouble." Alice studied the mining camp through a pair of field glasses Joe had produced from his saddlebags, noting the defensive positions and the careful placement of sentries that spoke of military planning rather than simple industrial security. Even from miles away, she could see that getting inside wouldn't be simple. The entire operation was designed like a fortress, with guards posted at every approach and riflemen positioned on the surrounding ridges. "The old mine shaft," Joe explained, pointing to what looked like a natural rockfall on the valley's eastern slope. "It connects to the main office building through tunnels that were sealed off years ago when they struck a gas pocket. But I know how to get through. Had been using them to move information for Blackwood without being seen by his other employees." Alice felt a chill at the admission, another reminder of the impossible position Joe had been forced into by threats against his family. "There's something else," Joe continued, his weathered face creased with guilt and determination. "I've been keeping records of everything Blackwood's done, every order, every crime, every innocent life lost. All of it written down and hidden in his office safe where he thinks it can't hurt him." The implications were staggering. If Joe possessed detailed records of Blackwood's criminal enterprise, they had the evidence needed to destroy him completely. But first, they had to retrieve those records and rescue Tommy Fletcher, all while staying alive in a place designed to kill intruders. There's one more thing you need to know. Joe said, his voice heavy with the weight of secrets finally being revealed. Blackwood's not just after your land, Alice. He's been planning this for years. A systematic campaign to drive out every small homesteader in the valley so he can consolidate all the water rights under his control. Why? What's so special about the water? Gold. Joe said simply, not in the mountains, but in the creek beds and river bottoms throughout the valley. Blackwood's had geologists survey the entire area, and they found placer deposits that could be worth millions if they can get access to enough water for hydraulic mining. Alice felt the blood drain from her face as the full scope of Blackwood's ambitions became clear. He wasn't just stealing individual homesteads. He was planning to destroy the entire agricultural economy of the region, turning fertile farmland into a moonscape of mining devastation in pursuit of underground wealth. How many people know about this? Just a few of his closest associates, and most of them are dead now, killed in accidents or Indian raids when they started asking too many questions. Joe's expression was grim as death itself. That's why he's so desperate to silence you and Wassa. You've seen too much, know too much. As long as you're alive, you're a threat to everything he's worked to build. The plan that emerged as they made their final approach to Fire Creek was desperate, but workable. Born of necessity, and shaped by the harsh realities of their situation. They would enter through the old shaft under cover of darkness, split up inside the complex to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously, and hope that Dr. Morrison's backup plan would bring federal authorities if they failed to return by dawn. Joe would head directly for wherever Tommy was being held, using his knowledge of the camp's layout to avoid the main guard positions. Alice and Wassa would make their way to Blackwood's office, retrieve the incriminating records from his safe, and hopefully confront the man himself to end his reign of terror once and for all. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only one they had. And as the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold that seemed appropriate for what lay ahead, they prepared to risk everything on one desperate gamble. The entrance to the old shaft was hidden behind carefully arranged rocks that looked natural, but had obviously been disturbed recently. Joe moved them aside with practiced efficiency, revealing a dark opening barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. A passage that led straight into the heart of Blackwood's operation. Single file, he whispered, his voice barely audible in the gathering darkness. Absolute silence once we're inside. Sound carries in these tunnels like you wouldn't believe, and guards patrol the main workings every hour. The tunnel was a nightmare of cramped spaces and unstable supports. Carved through solid rock by miners who'd been more concerned with speed than safety or comfort. They crawled through passages barely wide enough for their shoulders, breathing air that tasted of dust and decay. And something else fear perhaps left behind by previous travelers through this underground maze. Alice's lungs burned with each breath, and her clothes tore from scraping against rough stone walls that seemed determined to shred both fabric and flesh. Behind her, she could hear Wikasa's controlled breathing, feel his presence like an anchor in the suffocating darkness that pressed against them from all sides. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, a claustrophobic nightmare that tested every limit of her endurance and sanity. Just when she thought she couldn't crawl another foot without screaming, the passage opened into a wider space, some kind of natural cave that had been incorporated into the mine's workings decades ago. Ancient mining equipment lay scattered about, like the bones of some industrial graveyard, rusted and forgotten remnants of earlier, more optimistic times. But more importantly, they could hear voices echoing from somewhere above, the the sound of men talking and moving about their business in the world of light and air that seemed impossibly distant from their underground prison. Storage rooms directly above us. Joe whispered, his voice barely audible, even in the enclosed space. Office buildings another 50 yards through the main workings, but we'll have to be careful. Guards change shift at midnight, and they're always jumpy during the transition. They climbed carefully up a ladder that had seen better days, each rung testing their weight before they committed to it fully. The storage room was filled with mining supplies and crates of equipment that provided perfect cover as they oriented themselves to the camp's layout and prepared for the next phase of their mission. But as they prepared to move toward the office building, disaster struck without warning. A guard entered the storage room unexpectedly, his rifle at the ready, and suspicion clear in his eyes. He'd obviously heard something, a misplaced footstep perhaps, or the creak of old wood under their weight, and had come to investigate the source of the disturbance. Alice found herself face to face with the man, close enough to see the surprise in his eyes as he realized what he discovered. For a heartbeat that seemed to last forever, neither moved, both caught in that frozen moment between discovery and action that could determine whether they lived or died. Then training and desperation took over. Alice drove her knee into the guard's groin while simultaneously grabbing for his rifle, using every ounce of strength she possessed to prevent him from raising the alarm. The man doubled over in pain, but managed to hold on to his weapon, the two of them, struggling in deadly silence as Joe and Wassa rushed to help. The fight was brief, but brutal, conducted in almost complete silence to avoid alerting other guards to their presence. Wassa's knife found the guard's throat before he could cry out, but not before the man had managed to discharge his rifle accidentally. The bullet splintering wood somewhere in the darkness and echoing through the building like a thunderclap. "Move!" Joe hissed, his voice tight with urgency and fear. "That shot will bring every guard in the camp running to investigate." They burst from the storage room into a maze of corridors and walkways that seemed designed to confuse intruders. The sound of running feet and shouted orders already echoing around them as the camp's defenders mobilized to hunt them down. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by a desperate race against time as armed men converged on their position from all directions. This way, Joe led them through passages that twisted and turned like a serpent's path. His intimate knowledge of the building's layout, their only advantage as they tried to stay ahead of their pursuers. Behind them, Alice could hear their enemies getting closer. The sound of boots on wooden planks growing louder with each passing second. They reached a junction where the corridor split three ways, and Joe paused for a moment to get his bearings. "Tommy's being held in the main office straight ahead," he said, breathing hard from exertion and fear. "The safe with my records is in Blackwood's private office up those stairs." He pointed to a wooden staircase that led to the second floor of the main building. We split up. Alice decided, her mind working with crystal clarity despite the chaos around them. "Joe, get your grandson and get him to safety. Wassa and I will retrieve the evidence and deal with Blackwood." "Too dangerous." Wassa objected, his warrior's instincts, rebelling against the idea of dividing their forces in hostile territory. "If we get separated, then we die separately instead of together." Alice cut him off with harsh practicality. "But at least one of us might succeed in accomplishing our mission." Before anyone could argue further, the sound of approaching guards forced their decision. Joe disappeared down the corridor toward where his grandson was being held, while Alice and Wassa raced up the stairs toward Blackwood's office and whatever fate awaited them there. The wooden stairs creaked alarmingly under their weight, each step threatening to announce their presence to anyone within 100 yards of their position. But they had no choice. The evidence that could destroy Blackwood's entire criminal enterprise was somewhere above them, locked away in a safe that only Joe Fletcher knew how to open. They reached the second floor to find a long hallway lined with doors, most standing open, to reveal empty offices and storage rooms. But one at the far end was closed, a heavy wooden door with expensive brass fittings that practically screamed of importance and authority. That had to be Blackwood's private office, the nerve center of his criminal empire. But as they approached the door, Alice heard something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Voices from inside. And one of them belonged to Thaddeus Blackwood himself. Don't care how many men it takes. Blackwood was saying, his voice carrying the cold authority of absolute power and unlimited cruelty. Find them and kill them, all of them. The old man, the Indian, and especially that meddling woman. I want their bodies where no one will ever find them. What about the boy? Another voice asked, dead-eye. Dick, Alice realized with a chill of recognition that made her skin crawl. Kill him too. He's seen too much, heard too much. We can't afford loose ends, not when we're this close to achieving everything we've worked for. Alice felt rage building in her chest like a physical fire, burning away fear and replacing it with cold determination. They were talking about murdering a 7-year-old child simply because he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking, a reminder of just how completely evil had taken root in this place. Beside her, Wikasa's expression had gone deadly cold, his hand moving to his knife with the fluid grace of a predator preparing to strike. Murder was written clearly in his dark eyes, and Alice didn't blame him one bit for the violence he was contemplating. But before either of them could act, the office door swung open, and Thaddeus Blackwood stepped out, followed by Daddy Dick and 3 other armed men. For a moment, that seemed frozen in time. Predator and prey stared at each other across the narrow hallway. Both sides caught completely off guard by the unexpected encounter. Then chaos erupted with the sudden violence of a summer thunderstorm. Daddy Dick went for his gun with the speed of a professional killer. But Wikasa was faster, his knife, taking the man in the chest before his revolver could clear leather. Dick dropped with a gurgling scream that echoed through the building like a death knell, his blood spreading across the wooden floor in a rapidly expanding pool. Alice dove for cover as the other guards opened fire bullets, splintering the wooden walls around her and filling the air with deadly splinters and the acrid smell of gunpowder. She rolled behind a heavy desk that some previous occupant had left in the hallway, the solid wood providing minimal protection from the lead flying overhead. But Blackwood himself had taken cover in his office doorway, a nickel-plated revolver in his manicured hand, and murder blazing in his eyes like hellfire itself. "You've caused me considerable trouble, Miss Morrison," he called out conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather instead of trying to kill each other. "More trouble than any woman has a right to cause in a man's world." "Good," Alice shouted back, reloading her rifle with hands that shook from adrenaline rather than fear. "I was hoping to ruin your entire miserable life." Blackwood's laughter was like breaking glass, sharp and dangerous, and utterly without warmth. "Ruin my life, my dear woman. You've simply provided me with an excuse to accelerate my timeline. By tomorrow morning, every homestead in this valley will be nothing but ash and memory. Your neighbors will blame it on Indian savages, just as I've planned all along." "The territorial authorities know the truth," Alice replied, trying to keep him talking while she looked for a better position from which to fight. "Evidence is already on its way to federal marshals." "What evidence?" Blackwood's voice carried genuine amusement, the confidence of a man who believed he'd thought of everything. "The ledger that old fool Fletcher thinks he's hidden so cleverly, the one locked in my safe, where it's done me more good than harm by providing a detailed record of every crime committed by people who are now conveniently dead." Alice felt her heart sink like a stone dropped in deep water. If Blackwood had Joe's records, their entire mission was pointless. They'd risked everything for evidence that was already in their enemy's hands. But Wassa had moved during the conversation, using the sound of gunfire, and shouted threats to mask his approach through the maze of furniture and shadows. Now he appeared behind one of the remaining guards like a ghost, made manifest his knife-finding kidney and liver with surgical precision that spoke of long practice in the art of killing. The man dropped without a sound, leaving only Blackwood and one remaining gunman to face their wrath. "Persistent, isn't he?" Blackwood observed with grudging admiration, swinging his revolver toward Wicasa with deliberate care. "I'll enjoy watching him die slowly." But Alice was ready for him, her rifle speaking with the authority of righteous anger. The heavy bullet took Blackwood in the shoulder and spun him around like a child's top, his own shot going wild and burying itself harmlessly in the wooden ceiling above their heads. The last guard tried to bring his rifle to bear on Alice, but found himself staring down the barrel of Wicasa's Spencer carbine instead. The man's weapon clattered to the floor as he raised his hands in surrender, his face pale with the sudden realization that he was facing warriors who had nothing left to lose. "Smart choice," Wicasa said with deadly calm. Blackwood sat propped against the wall of his office, blood seeping through his expensive shirt, but his eyes still bright with malevolent intelligence and undenied hatred. "You think you've won something here?" He gasped pain, making his voice raspy, but not weakening his resolve. "Even if you kill me, there are others. Men with more money and fewer scruples than I ever possessed." "Maybe," Alice replied, checking her rifle's loads with mechanical precision. "But they'll have to start over from the beginning. Your organization dies with you. Or does it?" Blackwood's smile was terrible to behold, a reek of pain and malice that belonged in nightmares rather than waking life. "Tell me, Miss Morrison, have you considered what happens to your precious valley when the territorial government realizes how much gold lies beneath those homesteads? How long do you think your neighbors will be allowed to keep their claims when mining companies arrive with federal backing and unlimited resources?" The words hit Alice like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum psychological damage. Even in defeat, Blackwood was revealing the larger game forces beyond even his considerable reach that would eventually consume everything she'd fought to protect. "At least they'll have a chance to fight back," she said finally, refusing to let him see how deeply his words had shaken her. "Which is more than you ever gave them. Noble sentiments." Blackwood coughed blood, flecking his lips in a spray of crimson droplets. "But nobility doesn't stop bullets or change the fundamental nature of human greed. You're fighting a war you can't possibly win against enemies you don't even know exist." Before Alice could respond, the sound of approaching boots echoed through the building. Multiple men moving fast and with obvious purpose. Either Joe Fletcher had been captured and tortured into revealing their location, or Blackwood's remaining forces were closing in for the kill. "The safe," Vicasa said urgently, his eyes never leaving the surviving guard who stood with his hands raised. "If there's evidence to be found, we need it now." Alice looked at the heavy iron safe that dominated one corner of Blackwood's office, built like a fortress and designed to withstand everything short of dynamite. But Joe Fletcher had claimed to know the combination knowledge gained during his months of unwilling cooperation with Blackwood's schemes. "The combination," she demanded, pressing her rifle barrel against Blackwood's wounded shoulder with enough force to make him gasp in pain. "What is it?" Blackwood's laugh turned into a cough that brought up more blood, staining his carefully maintained appearance with the reality of his mortality. "You'd think I'd make it that easy for you?" The sounds of pursuit were getting closer now, voices calling back and forth as searchers coordinated their efforts throughout the building. Alice estimated they had perhaps minutes before being surrounded and overwhelmed by superior numbers. Then Joe Fletcher's voice echoed from somewhere below, carrying clearly through the wooden floors. "Alice Wisaka, where are you? I've got Tommy." Relief flooded through her, like cool water in desert heat. Joe was alive and apparently free, which meant Tommy was safe as well. But they still needed that evidence, and time was running out with each passing second. The combination, she repeated, applying more pressure to Blackwood's wound and watching his face contort with pain. Tell me, or I'll let you bleed out slowly while I search for it myself. Go to hell. Blackwood snarled through gritted teeth. But the remaining guard, still holding his hands up under Wikasa's watchful eye, cleared his throat nervously. It's his daughter's birthday, the man said quickly. Fear of death, overcoming whatever loyalty he might have felt. Month, day, and year, he changes it every year on the anniversary. Alice looked at Blackwood's face and saw the truth there rage at his subordinate's betrayal, but also confirmation that the information was accurate. When was she born? Alice demanded. October 15th, 1847, the guard said as quickly as possible, eager to purchase his life with information. 10:15:47. Alice moved to the safe and began turning the dial, her hand steady, despite the chaos around them and the pressure of knowing that their lives depended on her success. The first number clicked into place with satisfying precision, then the second. As she worked on the third combination, she heard Joe Fletcher's boots on the stairs, along with what sounded like a small child's footsteps. The safe door swung open with a click that sounded like salvation itself, revealing stacks of papers, bags of gold dust, and several leather-bound ledgers that contained the detailed records of Blackwood's criminal enterprise. Alice grabbed the ledgers, knowing they contained the evidence needed to destroy what remained of his organization and ensure that justice would finally be served. Got it. She called to Wikasa, who was keeping watch at the office door while maintaining his guard over their prisoner. Good, because we need to move immediately, he replied with urgency. Company's coming, and they don't sound interested in taking prisoners. Joe Fletcher appeared in the doorway, his grandson Tommy clinging to his hand with the desperate grip of a child who'd been genuinely terrified, but was now safe in the presence of someone who loved him. The boy looked scared, but unharmed. His young face streaked with tears, but his eyes bright with the resilience of childhood. Grandpa saved me, Tommy announced with the matter-of-fact bravery of a 7-year-old who'd survived something terrible. The bad men locked me up, but Grandpa came and got me out. That's right, boy. Joe said, his voice thick with emotion and relief. Nobody hurts my family and gets away with it. But their reunion was cut short by the sound of gunfire from below, the sharp crack of rifles echoing through the building as Blackwood's remaining forces discovered the bodies of their comrades and began systematically searching for the intruders who'd invaded their stronghold. Backstairs, Joe said urgently, his knowledge of the building's layout proving invaluable once again. There's another way out through the old mill building, but we need to move fast. They moved quickly through a maze of corridors and walkways. Tommy Fletcher, keeping pace with the grim determination of a child who understood that his life depended on staying quiet and moving fast. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer, as Blackwood's men followed their trail through the building with the persistence of hunting hounds. But as they reached the back stairs that would lead them to safety, disaster struck once more. A group of armed men appeared at the bottom of the stairwell, rifles raised and ready to fire at anything that moved. Alice counted at least 8 guns pointed in their direction. Impossible odds, even for fighters as skilled as Wikasa. End of the line, one of the men called up his voice, carrying the confidence of someone who held all the advantages. Come down slow and easy, or we start shooting and ask questions of whatever's left. Alice looked at the others, Joe holding his grandson protectively. Wisa calculating angles and distances with tactical precision herself, clutching the ledgers that contained their only hope of ultimate justice. They were trapped, outnumbered, and running out of options with each passing second. Then she heard something that made her heart leap with hope. The sound of horses approaching fast from outside, accompanied by shouted orders, and the distinctive jingle of military equipment that spoke of federal authority rather than local corruption. Dr. Morrison had kept her promise. Federal marshals were arriving in force, and they were arriving at exactly the right moment to turn the tide of battle. "That'll be the territorial authorities," Alice called down to the gunman with more confidence than she actually felt. "Federal marshals with orders to take everyone here into custody. You can surrender now and live to see trial, or you can resist and die right here on these stairs. Your choice entirely." For a moment, uncertainty flickered across the faces below as the men realized they were caught between advancing federal forces and desperate fugitives with nothing left to lose. Then one of them, older and clearly more experienced in the ways of frontier violence, made the decision for all of them. "Stand down," he ordered his men with the weary voice of someone who'd seen too much killing. "Ain't no job worth dying for, especially when the boss man's already done for." The siege of Fire Creek Mine was over-ended, not with a final battle but with the simple recognition that some fights couldn't be won, regardless of how many guns were involved. In the hours that followed, federal marshals swarmed through the mining complex like ants on a disturbed hill, documenting evidence and taking statements from everyone involved in the night's events. The ledgers Alice had retrieved from Blackwood's safe proved to be exactly what Joe Fletcher had claimed. Detailed records of every crime committed, every bribe paid, every innocent life destroyed in service of one man's insatiable greed. Thaddeus Blackwood himself was transported to the Territorial Prison Hospital under heavy guard, where Army doctors worked to save his life so he could stand trial for his crimes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the man who'd shown no mercy to his victims now depended entirely on others' mercy for his own survival. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise better days ahead, Alice found herself sitting beside Rock Creek once again. But this time she wasn't alone, and afraid Wicasa sat beside her on the bank, while Joe Fletcher played with his grandson in the shallows. Both of them celebrating their reunion with the simple joy of family, preserved against impossible odds. "But what happens now?" Alice asked, echoing the question that had started their entire adventure so many dangerous hours ago. "Now we rebuild," Wicasa replied, but his voice carried new hope, born of victory against overwhelming odds. "The territorial government has promised to establish a permanent reservation for my people, with guaranteed water rights and protection from mining companies. No more false accusations, no more scapegoating innocent people for crimes they never committed." "And your valley?" Joe asked, looking up from where he was teaching Tommy to skip stones across the water's surface. "What about your homestead and all the other claims Blackwood tried to steal?" Alice smiled, feeling something settle in her chest that had been restless and uncertain for far too long. "I think I'll stay and rebuild what was destroyed. The land is paid for with honest sweat and blood mine, and my husband's both. But maybe it's time to start thinking about the future instead of just honoring the past." She looked at Wicasa as she spoke and saw understanding passed between them like electricity through copper wire. What they'd found together wasn't the romance of dime novels and cheap fiction, but something deeper and more lasting: partnership forged in shared danger. Trust built through trials that would have broken lesser bonds. Besides, she added with a grin that would have looked at home on a wolf's face, "somebody needs to keep an eye on things around here. Make sure no more men like Blackwood come calling with their fancy schemes and hired guns." "Might be dangerous work," observed with matching humor. "Good thing I've got a reliable partner to watch my back." 3 months later, as autumn painted the aspen leaves gold and the first snow dusted the high peaks, Alice stood on the porch of her rebuilt home and watched the sun set over Rock Creek Valley. The community was healing slowly, But surely families were returning to their abandoned homesteads, and the threat that had terrorized the region was finally ended forever. The trials had been swift and decisive, with Judge Ricks presiding over proceedings that drew observers from across the territory. Blackwood's surviving associates had received sentences ranging from years to decades in the territorial prison, while the man himself faced the hangman's noose for his crimes against innocent people. But perhaps more importantly, the exposure of his conspiracy had led to broader reforms in territorial law enforcement and mining regulations that would protect future generations from similar predators. Wikasa emerged from the house behind her, carrying 2 cups of coffee and settling beside her on the wooden bench they'd built together during the long days of reconstruction. Their relationship had evolved slowly and naturally, growing out of shared trials and mutual respect, rather than the desperate passion of romantic fantasy. "Letter came from the territorial capital today," he said, handing her one of the cups. "The reservation boundaries have been officially surveyed and approved. My people will have permanent protection for the first time since the cavalry wars ended." "That's wonderful news." Alice smiled, genuinely happy for him and his family. "Will you be moving there?" "Eventually, perhaps, but there's work to be done here. First, helping other homesteaders rebuild, making sure the valley stays safe from men who might follow in Blackwood's footsteps." He looked at her with eyes that held promises of a shared future. "Besides, I've got reasons to stay." Alice felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. The comfortable certainty of a partnership that had been tested in fire and proven strong enough to last. As the stars began appearing in the darkening sky, she found herself thinking about the strange chain of events that had brought them to this moment of peace and possibility. She'd awakened to find a Lakota warrior pressed against her in what had seemed like the most threatening situation imaginable. But his reason, his desperate need to save her life at the risk of his own, had led to something neither of them could have anticipated. Love born from necessity. Trust forged in the crucible of shared danger. Partnership built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and proven reliability. It wasn't the romance celebrated in popular literature and poetry, but it was real and strong and absolutely their own creation. "Thank you," she whispered into the gathering darkness. "For what? For being there when I woke up, for the reason that left me speechless." His quiet laughter carried all the warmth of a hearth fire on a cold winter night. "Always happy to be of service, ma'am. Of service." And as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Alice Morrison and Wikasa settled into the peaceful rhythm of a life built on foundations strong enough to last forever. In the distance, Rock Creek murmured its eternal song, carrying away the last traces of violence and hatred that had once poisoned this beautiful valley. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and fresh possibilities. But tonight was perfect, exactly as it was. 2 survivors sharing the weight of hard-won peace, making even the heaviest burdens